Whilst I do see and speak with ghosts, I'm also highly sceptical about most ghost stories, and indeed the pastime of ghost hunting. Why? Well, I believe that our reality is a construct of our thoughts. Therefore, because I do believe in ghosts, I can and do sometimes see them, whilst those who don't are most unlikely to. Thus, for me, ghosts are as real, or as unreal, as what we see as the physical, such as a table. In folklore, a ghost is a soul or spirit of a dead person or non-human animal that is believed to be able to appear to the living. Descriptions of ghosts vary widely, from invisible presence to translucent or fairly visible wispy shapes to realistic, lifelike forms. Most Indonesian Muslims believe in ghosts, despite most Muslims in the Middle East now believing that they are simply a trickster jinn. Furthermore, whilst Indonesian ghost stories do sometimes relate to named deceased people, often they're a particular category of ghost, although even these may be of a named deceased person. Whereas now in Europe, many people believe that when we die, everything ends. Thus, there cannot be ghosts. A rather sad belief that was repeated to me by my mother on her deathbed. But a belief in ghosts is predicated on some form of an afterlife. Therefore, the scientific or atheistic insistence that death is an end means there can be no ghosts. Hence, the comprehension of what is a ghost differs across cultures and is far from universal. Belief in ghosts is found in most cultures around the world, although not all, as most vloggers would have you believe. And thus ghost stories may be passed down orally or in written form. There are many references to ghosts in Mesopotamian religions of Sumer, Babylon, Assyria and other states in Mesopotamia. Ghosts were thought to be created at the time of the death, taking on the memory and personality of the dead person. They travelled to another world where they were assigned a position and led an existence similar in some ways to that of the living. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the earliest examples of written literature. The ancient Sumerian tale follows the legendary king Gilgamesh, who after the death of his friend Enkidu is visited by Enkidu's ghosts. Enkidu's spirit return to warn him of the dark fate awaiting those who die unfulfilled or forgotten. Only those properly honoured by their loved ones find peace. Others suffer in the afterlife, and their restless spirits may return to haunt the living. Relatives of the dead were expected to make offerings of food and drink to the dead to ease their condition. If they did not, ghosts could inflict misfortune and illness on the living. Traditional healing practices ascribe a variety of illnesses to the actions of ghosts, while others were caused by gods or demons. There was widespread belief in ghosts in ancient Egyptian culture. The soul and the spirit were believed to exist after death, with the ability to assist or harm the living, and possibly of a second death. The overall period of more than 2,500 years, Egyptian beliefs about the nature of the afterlife evolved. Many of these beliefs were recorded in hieroglyphic inscriptions, papyrus scrolls and tomb paintings. The Egyptian Book of the Dead compiles some of the beliefs from different periods of ancient Egyptian history. The Hebrew Bible contains few references to ghosts, associating spiritualism with forbidden occult activities in Deuteronomy 18:11. In the Old Testament, the witch of Endor calls the spirit of the prophet Samuel. Ghosts in the classical world often appeared in the form of vapour or smoke, but at other times they were described as being substantial, appearing as though they had at a time been of death, complete with the wounds that killed them. Spirits of the dead appear in Homer's Odyssey, which features a journey to the underworld and the hero encountering the ghosts of the dead. Or Asteria, a trilogy of Greek tragedies, first performed in 1458 BC. BCE, do they call it BCE now? Anyway, it used to be called BC. Told the story of murder, revenge and justice. Regarded as Aeschylus' finest work, the trilogy features a character named Clementrastra, a ghost who seeks justice for a son who murdered her. This is one of the first appearances of a ghost in literature and is typical of ancient Greek beliefs about life after death and crossing over of the spirits into the world of the living. Pliny the Younger, circa 50 AD, and that is CE, isn't it? Yeah, CE now, yeah. So the other was BCE, is it? Describing the haunting of a house in Athens by a ghost bound in chains, an archetype that has become familiar in later literature. The play Musterelia by the Roman playwright Plautus is the earliest known work to feature a haunted dwelling and is sometimes translated as the haunted house. Centuries later, in 856 CE, the first poltergeist, a ghost to cause physical disturbances such as loud noises or objects falling or being thrown around, was reported linked to a property, a farmhouse in Germany. I cannot recommend strongly enough the channel Classic JG if you're interested in these classical ghost stories. The 11th century Japanese work, The Tale of Genji, contains ghost stories and includes characters being possessed by spirits. A Bhuta is a ghost of a deceased being in Indian religions. Interpretations of how Bhuta come into existence vary by religion and community, but they're usually seen as perturbed and restless due to some factor that prevents them from moving on to transmigration, none being nirvana or swarga or naraka, depending on tradition. These could be violent death, unsettled matters in their lives, or simply the failure of their survivors to perform proper funerals. In Buddhism, there's a number of planes of existence into which a person can be reborn, one of which is the realm of the hungry ghosts. If the hungry ghosts are fed by non-relatives, they would not bother the community. And many Chinese today believe it's possible to contact the spirits of their ancestors through a medium, and ancestors that can help descendants if properly respected and rewarded. The annual Ghost Festival is celebrated by Chinese around the world. One of the most frequently reported ghost sightings is Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII and mother of Queen Elizabeth I. Anne was executed at the Tower of London in May 1536 after being accused of witchcraft, treason, incest and adultery. The sightings of Boleyn's ghost have been reported at the Tower as well as in various other locations, including her childhood home, Hever Castle in Kent. Beginning in the late 19th century, Benjamin Franklin's ghost was seen near the library of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Some reports held that the statue of Franklin in front of the society comes to life and dances in the streets. Abraham Lincoln, the United States 16th president, who was killed by an assassin's bullet in April 1865. Lincoln, formerly a lawyer and congressman from Illinois, is said to have been seen wandering near the old Springfield Capitol building, as well as by his nearby law offices. At the White House, everyone from First Ladies to Queens to Prime Ministers have reported seeing the ghost or feeling the presence of Lincoln, particularly during the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt. As spiritualism developed in the United States and reached its peak growth in membership from the 1840s to 1820s, especially in English language countries. Indeed, an interest in ghosts always seems to follow a period when a great loss of life occurs, tapping into our desire not to lose contact with deceased loved ones. By 1897, it was said to have had more than 8 million followers of spiritualism in the United States and Europe, mostly drawn from the middle and upper classes, whilst the corresponding movement in continental Europe and Latin America is known as Spiritism. Certainly in the West, the bulk of our ghost stories can be traced back to this period, as is our understanding of ghosts. Modernity's distance and fear of death made modern spirits more fearful than previously. They no longer belong to the natural world, they're now part of the new supernatural. While older ghosts were braided into everyday life of peasant society, marking crisis and plenitude alongside of joys and fears, the modern spirits, whose features were now homogenised across cultures, only to represent fear. What strikes me in looking at how ghosts have evolved over time and differ between cultures is that are we correct in defining all as the same phenomena, undetected through the homogenisation I speak of? Just as many Muslims in modern day Middle East classify everything paranormal as jinns, are we guilty as classifying that much that is paranormal or simply unexplained as ghosts? Perhaps it's more practical to study ghost stories than ghosts, although inevitably the two are inseparable. Nevertheless, once we understand that we're describing literature or oral traditions, we become more impartial in spotting external factors impacting on these stories. In English Renaissance theatre, ghosts were often depicted in the garb of the living and even in armour. Armour out of date by the Renaissance gave the stage ghost a sense of antiquity. Ghosts in white sheets began to gain ground on the stage in the 1880s because an armoured ghost had to be moved around by complicated pulley system or lifts, becoming objects of ridicule. Unlike modern ghosts, who we often associate with uncanny sounds and mysterious shadows, older ghosts were resolutely corporal, with passions and needs similar to those of the living. Just as Muslims anthropomorphise jinn, ascribing them with human-like hierarchies and social organisations, so too were medieval ghosts. One of the early key appearances by ghosts was The Castle of Ontario by Horatio Walpole in 1764, considered to be the first Gothic novel. However, although the ghost story shares the use of the supernatural with the Gothic novel, they're not the same. Ghost stories, unlike Gothic fiction, usually take place in a time and location near the audience of the story. One of the factors important to M.R. James in 1929 in some remarks on ghost stories. The modern short ghost story emerged in Germany in the early decades of the 19th century. Kleist's 1810, The Beggar Woman of Locarno. The classic ghost story arose during the Victorian period and include authors such as M.R. James, Sheridan Le Fun, Violet Hunt and Henry James. These ghost stories were influenced by Gothic fiction tradition and contain elements of folklore and psychology. The European genre gave rise to Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, Edith Wharton, Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, F. Marion Crawford, and my personal favourite, Henry James, in the United States. Listening to Julia at Classic JG, I'm struck how formulaic most ghost stories are, often drawing on tropes developed in the Roman period. Indeed, given my interest in folklore, I'm struck by how often the same stories reappear in differing locations, often with very little changed between these stories, save for the names and locations. I believe the reason for these tropes is that ghost stories, rather than being observations, are actually created as forms of morality tales. Thus I'm suggesting that the oral tradition follows the written and not the obverse. Thus we can see the more persistent tropes as those being which enshrined a morality supported by the elites, who could afford to propagate and perpetuate them. I've often argued the same about sea theories, that these originate from the elites, and they are spread, at least initially, by the elites. However, to suggest that elites have uniform interests and act in coordination would be a sea theory in itself, and the last thing that I would wish to do. In medieval Europe, most ghosts were souls assigned to purgatory, condemned for a specific period to atone for their transgressions in life. Their penance was generally related to their sin. For example, the ghost of a man who'd been abusive to his servants was condemned to tear off and swallow bits of his own tongue. The ghost of another man who had neglected to leave his cloak to the poor was condemned to wear the cloak, now heavy as a church tower. These ghosts appeared to the living to ask for prayers to end their suffering. Other dead souls returned to urge the living to confess their sins before their own death. With the Reformation, the focus on purgatory was lost. Almost as though we can talk of a Catholic and a Protestant ghost story genre, with Protestants tending to reinforce other areas of Christian morality. Most pre-modern hauntings follow narrative conventions. An unquiet spirit appears in a certain location, or to a specific individual, reveal their reasons for its unrest, and receives help from the living in the afterlife. This Protestant morality is epitomised by Dickens' great ghost Scrooge, with the ghost of Dickens himself being a famous ghostly sighting. In fact, I would argue that, like the practice of magic, our belief and understanding in ghosts has been informed by religion, more so than religion responding to a belief in ghosts, however much religious authorities may protest. Indeed, as I have mentioned, a belief in ghosts is predicated on a belief in the afterlife, a central premise of most religions. Medieval ghosts were more substantial than ghosts of the Victorian age, and there are accounts of ghosts being wrestled with and physically restrained until a priest could arrive and hear its confession. In the folklore of Charlotte Byrne, there are many reports of ghosts being captured in bottles, often placed underwater in especially the Red Sea. So what am I seeing and speaking with ghosts? As I say, these are constructs of my beliefs, and my beliefs are formed by the tropes of Victorian English ghost stories, or more precisely, Hammer horror. But also since my childhood, most experience have been since I moved to Indonesia and embraced Kejawen, which includes a degree of ancestor worship. But make no mistake, this is not my mind playing tricks on me. unless you define the material as also thus. As I have said, this does not make ghosts unreal, but a construct of my beliefs, just as what I see is physical, such as tables.